Eritrean refugee experiences. So,
thank you very much. So I was asked to speak on the G15 and the impact of that, and the significance of it in Eritrean history and politics. And so I'm going to really start by going back a little bit into where I think the party that ran the EPLF, the EPRP, came from and what it did. What Eritrea looked like under EPLF in the 70s and 80s, and then what it looks like today. I had a book, Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners, which I wanted to point out to you guys. There we are. Hi, John. Oops. Wait a minute, technical issue here. Did with the people that became political prisoners, of course. They weren't when I talked to them, but Haile Tensai Duro, Mahmoud Sharifo, let's see, Petros Solomon, Oga Abraham, and Brahane Gabezgavir. In 2000 and 2001, leading up to their arrest and the purge of the G15. I'm going to come back to the book at the end of the talk, but let's see. Let me just take you back a little bit through my history. This is 1977, my second trip into Eritrea. The first time I came in was in 1976 with the EPLF and the ELF. I first went with EPLF for, I believe it was 2 weeks, and then came back out with ELF for 2 weeks. We switched in Wakitaba, and I came back again in 1977 and spent 6 months in the field with EPLF. What I saw when I was there was the organization of the front and the activities they were involved in that were not military. There were the underground workshops that were famous, of course, in many ways at the time. ELF had them too, but these are just the EPLF in that period. And they were repairing weapons here. They also made uniforms, medicine, and other things. This was in Fa. There were training camps. The women and the men were trained separately. There were also barefoot doctors and a public health system that was in its infancy then. They had clinics, remote clinics in different parts of the liberated zones. And they also had these barefoot doctors, as they're called, these backpacking paramedics mostly, who went around teaching sanitation, hygiene, and basic curative medicine. And they also ran schools. This was in Zager in 1977, where they had curricula that was in several different Eritrean languages that they produced in the field in one of those underground workshops. And behind this, they had a highly politicized front that was, in this case, doing a study out of the Little Orange Book, I would call it. Wait a minute. This was the political manual, really, for the party that was operating inside EPLF at the time, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. Very few people were aware of this who were not members, although there was a suspicion throughout the front that there might be a party. But it was a secret party operating within the front The person who was behind it was Haile Tensai, whom I met in his tent, really, in the base area. This is an organizational chart behind him, and I was interviewing him here about the role of the cadre school, which was basically the training ground for the party members who went out into the front. Okay. Petros Solomon this is in Nakba. He was the commander of the Nakba front for a period. But they were, of course, key in the G15. I also met the big guy there. You've probably seen this photograph. That's Isaias and his bunker in Nakba. And while I was there, I was asking if I could, actually this is 1979, I wanted to go behind the lines to see what the EPLF was doing in the highlands, in Kabasa, after the withdrawal. Because the world, the media were saying, this struggle's over. And it wasn't. And I knew it wasn't, but I had to go there and see it for myself to report on it to be convincing. So I got permission to go. And I went up, we walked around Alphabet. We walked up through Gelib, down to Shed, to Philphil, up through Salamona, and outside Asmara, looking in. What I found there was what I had seen before, and that was that the fighters were dug in many places along the way. The government then, the Ethiopian administration, the occupation forces, held the towns, and they used the roads by day, but by night they were being used by the two fronts. There were again improvised schools, and there was medical care. Again, this is walking up to the islands after a strafing. And of course, there was the famine that came in the mid-'80s that held back the struggle. But once again, the front was very well organized, very efficient, and this was something that was a function of the role of the party, I think, within the front. The party shaped the attitude, the behavior of many of the members through its own teachings and example. With some mixed results, as I'm learning from reading Mesfin Hagos's memoir that's out now, which I'll come back to too. It's an African Revolution, the reclaiming an African Revolution. But in 1991, after the independence, people also came back by the hundreds from outside, some for a short period, some for longer periods, to help rebuild the country. And I point that out because the contrast with what happened in 2018 when Eritrea and Ethiopia made peace, or at least Abiy and Isaias did, was striking. Instead of people coming back, more people left. So the volunteerism of that era is gone. I think you don't see much of this anymore, except you see national service. This was Amadeiro. This was the community coming out and building that dam on a volunteer basis. But in 1998, as already been said, of course, this was the next round of war. This was Sarona, where I was in 1998 and 1999. To witness the fight. And then, of course, people were back in the bunkers. This is a scene from right outside Sarona. Could have been Nakba in the 1970s, and it could be Eritrea today. In 2001 and 2002, of course, the door shut. Figuratively, this is my figurative door, but of course it shut on discussion of this, criticism of the war, and criticism of the government. So now, political repression really took hold during the war and afterward. It was there before and it was there during the liberation struggle. But it substantially increased in 98 to 2000 during the border war, so-called. I put that in quotes because I think it was really a political struggle and not a border war. The Eritrea lost that war basically in the end as Ethiopia broke through the mountains and took over at least a quarter of the Eritrean territory before they were blocked from getting onto Asmara. Criticism of Isaiah's leadership grew up during that time within the front. And I started talking with Haile Tensai, the first conversation in the book that I mentioned, conversations with Eritrean prisoners, political prisoners, took place in January of 2000, between the second and third round of the war with Ethiopia. And in it, I started asking Haile, what was the role of the EPRP and how did it affect things? Because I was seeing what looked like the same kind of government now as I had seen in the 70s. And there is and was an inner circle doing much of the leadership in the post-war period too, the post-independence period. But in the lead up to that, in 2000, there was criticism inside the front in the Central Committee of the PFDJ, as it was then called, and within the National Assembly. That's detailed in Messman's book in interesting ways. I really recommend it if you want to go back to this period to see what was going on with Isaiah and how he managed to set the stage for what was in effect a coup from within. Of course, in May 2001, the struggle inside the front blew up into the public with the publication of the open letter in May by 15 prominent critics who were labeled the G15. There were more of them, of course, in the beginning. This was a discussion that started involving a lot of people in the leadership. Only 15 ended up signing it. One, of course, recanted, and 3 were out when the arrest took place in September of 2001, and Messman was one of them. But the other 11 were arrested and have disappeared. After that, the press was shut down, and hundreds more were arrested throughout the country. This left the Constitution unimplemented in 1997, national elections indefinitely postponed, and all parties and independent organizations banned, except for those run by the PFDJ and its satellites, the various unions. In April 2002, the ban was expanded to include unsanctioned religious groups. Next. But the political culture of Eritrea's ruling party has been set from the earliest days in the 1970s. It's always been an authoritarian one, predicated upon the exercise of power by a small number of people operating in secret, basically. And that was justified in a certain way during the struggle. But it transformed the leadership in ways that continued afterward. And the political culture was really set for the 90s. The EPRP, as it was called, that was set up in 1971 and then faded a bit, and then it was resurrected again in 1974 after the Menka episode. And it ran the front from then on. It made all its basic decisions, day-to-day running of the front. It picked the slates of leaders for the congresses that EPLF had. So the EPLF had 2 congresses, 1977, 1987. The EPRP had 2 congresses also, 1976, the previous December, and 1986. So the front was really a showpiece, in effect. because it was really the party that mattered. The new state was dominated by former EPRP cadres and run as before by a clandestine inner core afterward. The difference, it was handpicked by Isaias and not accountable to a base. And I'm talking about the leadership of PFDJ in 1994. Okay, one more slide. So I want to go through a timeline of Isaias's takeover. And I could actually go back to the 1970s and the different crackdowns that took place within EPLF then on Nunca and Yamin, but 1987 was decisive. He shook up the EPLF leadership then. He changed the leadership of the party also, bringing in new Central Committee members from the armed forces that were loyal to him. And they, in turn, were then part of the political bureau of the EPLF. The party CC was basically the core of the EPLF's executive function, the executive committee. Then in the early 1990s, after independence, there were a series of actions that were taken that revealed the direction of the front. This time, during these first 4 years of transition, it was the party CC that was still meeting. Isaias had claimed that the party had been disbanded in 1989. And in effect, the base had been cut loose by executive decision, not by a collective one, but by his decision alone. But the party continued as a core until 1994, when he restructured the PFDJ leadership, claiming, of course, that he was introducing new blood. There were protests during this time, 93 and 94, which everybody knows about, the protests of the fighters in 93, just before the independence celebration. And then the disabled fighter protest in Mayatal on the Massawa Dinda Road in 94, which was put down by commandos sent there, according to Messman in his book, without his knowledge, despite the fact that he was the Minister of Defense. And I think these two books, mine and his, are quite revealing of the way Isaias exercised power throughout this time. There was nominally a structure, an institutional structure, but he went around it whenever it suited him. So he had a Minister of Defense, but he went around it to deal directly with the generals when he wanted to. And he actually, in the border war with Ethiopia, he actually ran many of the decisions of individual units. He's a micromanager, of course. But in 97, his refusal to implement a ratified constitution was decisive. I think the Constitution has all kinds of problems, and I'm not pushing it as the model Constitution. But it was a step, at least, that would put some curbs on his power, and he refused to implement it. Then you had the border war. As was laid out earlier, that border war came after several other wars. With Yemen, of course, the Hanish Islands, almost with Sudan in 1994, and then finally with Djibouti, of course. So, in effect, during that period, Isaias waged war with all of his neighbors at one time or another, and mostly without the input of other cabinet members who were just a showpiece for his need for an institutional representation. In fact, there was an inner core of people who were making the decisions, and they were, just like before, a clandestine group who shifted a bit and was not the collective leadership that there had been, nor were they accountable to a membership as the party had been. So there's a steady narrowing of Isaias's control all the way up through the 80s and 90s until finally he gets protest in 2000 by the PFDJ. Dissidents, I'm calling them. Messman calls them reformers. In May and September of that year, there were meetings at which the issues came up of the character of the war, the conduct of the war, and the delays and in democratization. I would trace that back to the lockout of ELF and other nationalists in the early 90s, and the indication that the mass organizations and village administration had been transformed from basically grassroots, a version of grassroots participation at least, into top-down appointed officials. So everything shifted. The power shifted increasingly to the top into a smaller and smaller circle of people, and most of those people handpicked by Isaiah himself. When the arrest came in 2001, there was very little protest because Isaiah had laid the groundwork for months and months. The G15, whom I was interviewing some of in the lead up to that, knew that this was coming. And one of the last things they did was to publish a manifesto in August of 2001. I really recommend that to people because it lays out not just a critique of the past, as the open letter had, but a vision of the future, what they saw as Eritrea's future, what it could have been. And I just want to, one more slide here. No, it's got to go, yeah, one more, there it is. The August 3rd manifesto, which I think is one of the most important documents of that period, was published in one of the Eritrean, the Asmara newspapers. I think it was Sati. It looked to the future, and it called for changing the policy of Eritrea toward Ethiopia, Sudan, and Yemen to increase security and trade and end support for armed opposition groups operating across each other's borders. Imagine if that had happened then. Democratizing governmental institutions, strengthening civil society, encouraging market forces, divesting the PFDJ of its economic holdings, reforming both the land and language policies, which are obviously weak and not dealt with in the Constitution, freeing political prisoners or charging them in open court if they had committed a crime, and finally developing or expanding programs for Social Security, subsidized housing, vocational training, and assistance to disabled fighters and demobilized veterans. So the core group had moved from its Leninist beginnings to really a kind of social democratic position, similar maybe to Norway or Sweden. And this was their last thoughts put out before the crackdown. They expected, I think, naively, that there would be resistance to their arrest. There wasn't, of course, and instead they kind of disappeared from view, and they're remarked on every September in memory. Most of them we know are not alive, and others, of course, have disappeared since then along with them. So they are not the only ones languishing in prison for life sentences, basically, with no visitors permitted or any access to anybody outside. So before I get into the significance of this, I want to just say something about how I think this took place. There were two processes going on here throughout the period leading up to the arrest in 2001 and the turning of Eritrea basically into a kind of police state and a dictatorship. One was the steady narrowing of leadership, as I mentioned, and moving from some accountability, limited accountability, but some, to a top-down regime basically under one person. The other thing that was going on was the development of a political cult in Eritrea. The kind of education that went on in the 70s and 80s of the fighters, for example, that I showed some slides of the results in terms of the social programming, the commitment to service, and so on, really have disappeared. The army now is strictly a military operation. It has none of that political or social character to it. And Eritrea has become a warrior state, as others have pointed out. Isaiah's knee-jerk reaction to every problem in the neighborhood is to pull out the guns and go to war. He has made Eritrea powerful by building a warrior state like Sparta in the Greek tradition. And that has left the rest of the economy to languish, the society to be gutted by out-migration. The people estimate that maybe a quarter of the population has left since the 90s. The CIA World Factbook, maybe you noticed, has a population figure of 5 to 6 million. It's nonsense, of course. We know that the population is much closer to 3 million now. Maybe 3.2, maybe less. Why? Yeah, I know. A lot of people think it's in the high 2 millions. Okay. Nobody knows outside the government. The government knows exactly how many people are there because everybody has been given an ID card. They have gone around and tracked all that. But they don't give those figures. They don't publish a budget either, so who's surprised at this? But how have they done this? Let me just go into the cult formation because I did some study of this afterward, and I've written about this in the second edition of Against All Odds, which was not a reprisal, but a reappraisal. So if we can just go to the last slide here, the second to the last, actually. One more. The mechanics of cult construction. Now, I'm not taking this from Eritrea, but you tell me if it sounds familiar. This comes from the literature on cult building, political cults. The first thing you do is isolate your members from the outside world. And you mix you foster an us against them, we, they identity. And you limit their contact as much as possible to other members who can reinforce their beliefs. 2, dependency. Unquestioning loyalty and submission is part of cult building, without which it can't exist. Doubts or questions are not permitted. And the enforcement is punishment by shame and ostracism, as well as physical punishments. But the shame and ostracism, the exclusion from the group, is a big part of it. Indoctrination is a third part. Well, fear, of course, is a big part. Acts of subordination or expressions of dissent are punished with physical abuse and emotional trauma, usually involving public humiliation and exclusion. You must have heard the stories about people in Sawa who raise questions and they're taken out and left in the sun in an auto position or a helicopter position in front of others. Meanwhile, indoctrination is critical. Members give up their personal independence and break ties with family, friends, and other identities and belief systems. Somebody needs to be muted. Can I? Yeah, okay. Here, I just want to finish this quick, and then I'll be done.
Take out the shape. Okay.
Okay. You need a charismatic leader to whom unquestioned loyalty and obedience rise to the level of hero worship, as ASOP work here, of course. Vocabulary and ritual, it's essential to identity replacement and loyalty to build that through shared activities and seminars with an all-encompassing worldview. That, of course, has been the signature of the PFDJ. And defense mechanisms, the development of defenses against external challenge or doubt, coupled with the threat of excommunication. Now, I use that term carefully because we often think of cults as a religious sect, but sectarianism, of course, can include politics, and the excommunication is a big, big part of how the PFDJ tries to keep people in line. So that's basically it for the slides. The next one is just a link to my website, if you're interested. danconnell.net. You can see my articles, a lot of my articles, and links to books, and that's enough for the slides. So, I can't see my watch.
Does anyone have any questions for him?
Okay.
Dan, it's nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And thank you for your excellent presentation, particularly helping us to revisit the historical perspective of the Eritrean struggle for national independence. But given the theme of this conference is regime change, and also given your intimate knowledge of Eritrea and the Eritrean opposition, I wonder if you can share with us some advice in terms of what Eritreans in the diaspora should do to change the regime. I understand this is, of course, the business of the Eritreans to handle, but I think your views on this matter will be very much appreciated if you may. Depending on your answer, I may have a follow-up question. Thank you.
Let's see. Whoops.
You want to go back?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get out of this. Okay. You know, I think that the sense I had of looking at other struggles, okay, not a specific piece of advice for you, but when people revolt, they usually do so not just because conditions are bad. In Eritrea, conditions are bad, what do people do? They leave. The revolt takes place when you have something to believe in, to fight for. And that has been the thing that is most important and has been missing, I think, in the struggle to date. Everybody favors democracy, so every group has it. PFDJ has democracy in its name. What does democracy mean? That's where I think that manifesto that the G15 put out in their last month of freedom is really interesting, because they lay out some basics. A vision of a more market-oriented society. Still an egalitarian society, though. They still had their values that they had in the beginning. But they understood that they had to have much more freedom of movement, competition within the economy, competition within the political arena, in order to strengthen what was going on in the country and the future of it. And I think that kind of vision is necessary as the first step. A vision, a simple one, not a whole program, not a 16-page document, but a simple principles of where we want to see Eritrea go. And I think if you look from there at what, I spent a lot of time in South Africa also with the South African movement. And never mind where the ANC is today, but they built that movement, the anti-apartheid movement, by focusing on a few things and by providing a vision of a future at the same time. And I think they made terrible mistakes too, and I write about that in Rethinking Revolution. But it was really a matter of having a vision that, if you look at the South African Constitution, for example, it's an aspirational constitution. It has a vision in it. It doesn't say what has to be now, but it sets up requirements that the government has to follow and has to show that it's at least working toward the goals in that document. That kind of thing would be really helpful to mobilize people, I think. And what's necessary, of course, is unity around a basic vision.
Okay, thank you for your answer, but still, I don't think you answered it the way I was hoping you would.
I know.
So my follow-up question is this. My follow-up question, let me rephrase the question. Don't you think that one of the things that we Eritreans in the diaspora should do to change the regime is to stop our fragmentation? I think one of the things that has hurt us is we are too fragmented to be effective. And hence, if we can unite together and come up with a body that represents the Eritreans in the diaspora, don't you think would have been more effective to hasten the change of the regime? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was what I was getting at, and yes, I do. I think that's exactly what's necessary. What do you do with the PFEJ?
Let's read
Well, I mean okay, now you're dividing the society in a serious way. My advice is you have to, if you want to be inclusive, you have to really be inclusive and figure out a way to do that with punishing the criminals, but not everybody. If you look at examples again of where this kind of regime change is taking place, look what the U.S. did in Iraq. They wiped out the Ba'ath Party altogether. They closed down the military, and they created ISIS and an insurgency. Because where could you go? All these people who had training were out. And they were out in opposition in dangerous ways. So you have to think, if you want to really think inclusively, you have to be able to include a lot of people you may not agree with or like. Okay? Except that I want to leave a copy of Conversations with Felsi.
Okay.
And it